father who taught me how to take hold of stories. Growing up, I knew a lot about God's story. My father, the ruler of the synagogue, taught me not only to love God's commands, but also to admire the lives of the Jews that had come before us. I used to beg my father to tell me the story of Moses, and especially the time that his hands saved the Israelites. Well, my father would remind me that it was really God working through Moses' hands. He would tell me of Moses on this high hill, his hands raised in prayer as the Israelites fought in battle below him. As long as he kept his hands up and kept praying, the Israelites were winning. But as soon as he dropped them, they began to lose, and he realized he needed to keep them up. When his arms got tired, his friends Aaron and Hur stood on either side of him and held his arms. Moses' people were saved because he allowed God's power to work through his hands. When I was a little girl, I would often stare at my own hands and wonder if they had that kind of power in them. But as I got older, I was really only concerned about the absence of a ring on my left one. And it was just before I was of marrying age that I fell violently ill with a fever. For a while, my mother would come to my room and continue to teach me what I would need to know to take care of my own household, but soon we realized that I would not be able to live long enough to live out her teachings. She was soon replaced by a steady pouring in and out of doctors that my father hired. My father, though, was reluctant to leave my side for anything. He made people come to him for things. And so this one night, the elders of the synagogue came and told us that a blasphemer was coming to Capernaum. This man, called Jesus, claimed to be the Messiah. He did not seem like, though, one of those people who would periodically pop up and claim to be the Messiah until they were crushed by Romans. This was different. The elders, though, assured us that he was a nobody, a carpenter, someone who had to work with his hands, not the kind of king that the prophets had predicted. So my father agreed to stay away from him until he heard that Jesus was healing people. When Jesus arrived in Capernaum, my father knew he could not require a servant to fetch Jesus because the elders had passed their judgment. So my father had to go himself. And after he left my side, I got really sick. And things started to fade in my memory. I do remember, though, that after a while, someone took my hand in theirs and said, "Talitha cum," or "Little lamb, stand up." And I did, and I opened my eyes immediately and began walking around and realized that my fever was finally gone, and that it was a man called Jesus who had healed me. I looked at his hands. It was true, they were not king's hands. They were unadorned except for a bruise or a callus. And he saw me looking, and he smiled. And for a moment, when I looked into his eyes, it seemed like he knew all about me. Jesus had 3 other men with him, and he warned them and my family to tell no one the details of what had just happened. My father was crying, and my mother was shaking until Jesus asked her to get me something to eat. My father thanked him, and then Jesus and the 3 left. As I ate the bread my mother had given to me, I asked her who died, since there were mourners outside of the window. And then she started sobbing and held me close, and I understood. My father explained what had happened while I was asleep, that he went to Jesus and fell at his feet and asked him to come and heal me, and Jesus consented, but on the way he had to heal another woman, and by that time the servant came from my father's house to tell him that he shouldn't bother with Jesus anymore because I had already died. But Jesus came anyways. And I remember that my father wiped tears from his face as he described how the hired mourners laughed at Jesus and how Jesus had to cast them out. And then he came and healed me, and I knew the rest. Over those next couple weeks, I gathered what news I could about this Jesus. People said that he was casting out demons, that he even healed someone on the Sabbath. Who was this man that not only had power over disease, but also death? Soon though, the synagogue elders in Capernaum were not the only ones that felt threatened by his power. As the months went on, I began to forget what a gift my life was. I married, and the responsibilities of my new family began to consume me. Until one day, my father came to me, and he told me that people were plotting Jesus' death. This scared me as I never got to say thank you to him. So my husband gave me permission to leave with my father for Jerusalem, where people said Jesus was. We arrived in Jerusalem around the time of Passover at my father's brother's house. And I remember that as we ate that Passover meal, my uncle told us that it was already too dangerous for any Jew to be seen hanging around Jesus. And that night, as I tried to fall asleep, I kept remembering the day I had been revived. Was not Jesus at least a prophet, if not the Messiah? Who else would God grant authority over death? Could Jesus really be the Son of God? I remembered the words of the prophet Isaiah, that God's own hands laid the foundations of the earth, that his right hand spread out the heavens. Had that hand really touched my sinful hand? These questions weighed on my heart, and I had to have answers. So I got out of bed, and even though it was looked down on for a woman to go out alone, I decided I had to find Jesus myself. I remember that the streets were more crowded than I had anticipated so early in the morning, and I asked the man what was going on, and he said that a criminal was being taken to Pilate. This man, Jesus of Nazareth, had committed blasphemy. I walked away from the man mortified. What had Jesus done to deserve suffering? I wanted to tell the crowd passing by that they were making a mistake. I wanted to tell them that Jesus had raised me to life. But instead, I just joined in with a group of women who were following the crowd. I introduced myself, and one of them, Mary, said she was Jesus' mother. I began weeping as I told her all that her son had done for me. She understood. Embracing me, she told me that Jesus had touched each of these women's lives. One of them, a mother of some of his disciples. Another, Mary Magdalene, had demons cast out by him. So it was together that we watched Pilate wash his hands and hand Jesus into the crowds to be crucified. And Jesus, through it all, was silent. I watched as they put hateful nails in his wrists, binding the hands that had healed me. They put him on a hill between two criminals, and as his fingers twitched, I realized that the outstretched arms and the men on either side of him reminded me of a story my father used to tell me. Moses' hands had saved the Israelites. Who were Jesus' hands saving? And I remember that he prayed, and that he finally uttered, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, and that his hands went limp, and I felt that everything was wrong. Could the Son of God really die? What did that mean for the rest of us? That there was no hope? How could God send him here and then allow this to happen? I mourned with the women. Never have I seen such suffering. Never have I cried out to God from the bottom of my being like that. But on the first day of the week, Jesus' mother and the other Mary went to his tomb to anoint him. But when they came back, they told us that Jesus had left the tomb, and he wanted his disciples to go to Galilee to meet him there. At first, none of us believed them, but soon we understood the truth. I rejoiced with the women and thanked God that once again, Jesus had power over death. I went back to my father and told him what had happened, that we should try to go back home and try to find Jesus again. I never did get to see Jesus again. But my father met with some of his disciples who told him that Jesus really had risen and that they even felt the holes in his hands. And from that day onward, I knew that I would forever hold on to the story of the hands that had once saved me and had now saved all nations.